welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one chapter at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Brandon.
How you feeling this drippy March morning?
Oh, pretty good. Yeah, we had our full spring last week, and now we're back to normal March, Pacific Northwest. So
Yeah, this cadence of fall, spring, and the daffodils come up, and then rain, and then more daffodils come up, and
uh,
yeah, it's
yeah,
I don't know how it is in your part of the country, listeners, but that is basically how it works in the Northwest. It's a lot of push and pull and saying one thing and then another with the
yeah,
sky. And in the case of this chapter, Paul seems like he's saying one going one direction, then he veers another, and then back and forth. So this has been a fun one to do a little pre-show on trying to make sense of and wrap our minds around Romans 7. This is the chapter where Paul is getting really into the way in which Torah surfaces deviations in oneself and one's community, and the inner tension of like it. I have the standard, but having this standard doesn't mean I actually do it, and I do the thing that's opposite. And he gets all tangled up in these things. That's where we find this stuff.
yeah, yeah. We talked at the very beginning of Romans about the Romans road and how like these single verses or maybe a two or three verses get pulled out here and there to weave this really, quite frankly, demonic, like diabolical, false gospel of you're a piece of shit. But guess what? God loves you anyway. As like that's the whole point of the Bible.
Rule
And
breaking, rule keeping, and
yeah.
yeah.
So the other place that I've seen that done is if you want to take a little more sustained section, is people do that with like chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is you're the little piece of turd that can't, even if you want to do well, you just can't. And then 8 is like, okay, but now we can breathe easy because none of that matters for some reason all of a sudden.
Yep. Yeah.
I don't think either of those are really the point of either chapter. So we'll see what we actually find.
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we get into that? So we're gonna try something just a little different this week. We're gonna work our way through this chapter paragraph by paragraph. So Brandon, would you please begin? Well, actually, I do want to just acknowledge this is similar to last week, where there weren't a lot of like new translation shifts that we can
Mm.
like point at in the text. Um, what we see here is really like, as in 6, is the unfolding of a couple of key translation changes that really do, when you stick with that and with this lens of it being a letter about everyone belonging on the terms of God's love and faithfulness, not our tribal. I shouldn't use, that's not the right word.
Not our group identity,
Yeah, our group
basically.
identity. Yeah, like whatever formats our group identity is not our actually the terms of God's belonging. So it's a pastoral letter against um supremacism and exclusion, and advocating for a deeper, wider belonging grounded in the work of God through
Yeah,
Christ.
yeah,
Uh And he's
Yeah,
working.
not a lot of new changes, but a lot of the same changes that we've talked about before, having a significant payload here.
Yeah, yeah. And the big one is going to be Torah. Is going to be, we're not talking about an
Mm,
abstract universal law of right and wrong, rule breaking and keeping. This is talking about a particular revelation and memory of revelation among his people, which is the Torah, and what we do about that. So we're going to go through this through the lens of this isn't about your failure to uphold and be faithful to this universal law, capital L. This is about
right.
Torah and for his people. And secondarily, we may be able to infer kind of adjacent to that, some other things. But this
Yeah.
is what he's talking about. So let's go ahead and read that first paragraph, 1 through 3.
Yeah, let me bring it up here. All right. Here we are, litbible.net/Romans-7. Okay. So we had talked about this first paragraph a little bit last week, but worth going over again, the sense of being released from the contract that we were discussing last week. Or don't you know, family, since I'm speaking to those who know Torah, that the Torah is Lord over a person for as long as they live. A married woman has been bound by Torah to a man while he is alive, but if the man dies, her obligation to Torah regarding the man has been counteracted. So then, if she were to come to be with a different man while the man is alive, she would be called maritally unfaithful. But if the man dies, she is liberated from the Torah obligation. She is not being maritally unfaithful, having come to be with another man. Or the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So yeah, we talked about these actually last week.
Yeah, we can just kind of summarize real quick here, and then
Mm-hmm.
get to the so what next, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty straightforward paragraph as far as how it applies to everything else we're talking about. That still have maybe has some question marks, but it just makes sense. Like there's a covenant, a contractual agreement of like we're partners here. We don't have sex with other people. That's we're not consenting to that. Um, we're married. There's things that go with being married, right? And if you do the opposite of that, then that's a problem. If I'm alive, if I die, we're not married anymore. Like your obligations to stay faithful to me have ended. Um, and you can find a new partner, right? So that's pretty straightforward. And in some way, Paul is equating following the obligations of Torah in general with and using this example of being married as a clear way to help it be understood what he's trying to describe.
Mm-hmm. Like death releases you from a marriage covenant, and death releases you from a Torah, the covenant of
Yeah.
Torah. Um,
Yeah. And as I was talking about, as part of this same discussion, the chapter breaks are weird. Uh, in
sure.
a document that used to be a scroll, no page breaks, no paragraph breaks, not even spaces between the words, but uh, we've got these breaks now.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
chapter 6, it was also talking about like the debt obligations too, like that the sense of restitution being when we have wronged people, we owe them. But when we die, like our kids aren't responsible to make that right or something. Like it's not debt forgiveness comes when we die as well. The obligation to fulfill Torah in that way or in this way, like all the obligations end at death.
All the obligations. Yeah. So let's move along then to the next paragraph.
Uh,
This is
so to
verses
speak, my
4 through 6, those listening.
yes, you know, so to speak, my family, through Christ's body, you too died regarding Torah, for you to come to be with another person, with the one who was raised from among the dead, so that we would produce fruit for God. When we were in bodily existence, experiences of suffering, deviations, were enacted through the Torah among the parts of our body, resulting in producing fruit for death. But now, after dying, our obligation to the Torah, with which we were being restrained, was counteracted, for us to be enslaved workers with a newness of life breath and not with the antiquatedness of a written document.
All right, now things are picking up steam.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
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 What shifts for you here with the language around Torah, in verse 5 there, bodily existence instead of the flesh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the legacy of like of translating sarks as flesh is pretty complicated and messy in um Christianity. I think most branches of Christianity, but certainly the evangelicalism that we both swam in, where it really is used as shorthand to shame sexual deviation and sexual
Mm-hmm.
behavior that is found to be out of step with what that particular community believes. Um, and like, oh, I feel desire, I feel sexual desire in my body. That's a bad thing. Like desires and for delight that we might feel in our body is becomes a
Mm-hmm.
place that we can't trust because that's where sin deviations come from, right? So we all, so many of us have so much trauma and having to relearn how to listen to our bodies and how to re-script longing as actually sacred,
Mm-hmm.
desire as the place where our humanity um invites divinity and receives it. Learning that your body, your flesh, is a place of goodness, and it's good that you have a body. It isn't the final hope is not for a loss of body.
No.
God's final hope is for our bodies, is for the world, for materiality. There's so much that goes into this one um really problematic translation legacy. And it's not as much a translation legacy as it is
Interpretive. Yeah.
it as it is like a wider tradition of centering and fixating on sexual sins.
Right. Yeah. Because flesh is like, it's kind of outdated in a lot of ways, but it's technically right. The word literally means like the stuff our bodies are made of.
Yeah.
Um, but it gets used to mean a lot of things, almost none of them having to do with sex.
Hmm.
So it means like lineage, like family lines. It means like being alive. It means just my body being a physical thing.
Yeah.
It it means all sorts of things, and it the impulses to feel alive, to avoid feelings of deprivation, of scarcity, of this anxiety around what if I don't have enough? What if I die? Even if that's kind of below the conscious level of behind the actions, like that's what it's talking about. Where it starts to get into this kind of metaphorical, like condition discussion.
Yeah.
And there are lists of behaviors that describe the kinds of things that giving examples of that. And it's almost never about sex. Like sexual stuff might be in there once or twice in a long list of things, but most of the things in those lists have to do with being aggressive or hostile or like selfishly meeting my needs over and against other people's needs, using other people as objects, being violent, being greedy, hoarding, like those are the things that Paul typically has in mind when he's talking about the flesh in that way.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
porneia, we've talked about before, where it's typically translated as sexual immorality, is typically much more like sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, uh, those kinds of things, not just like two people who aren't married having sex with each other or thinking about sex or like these things that we're taught in youth group. Like if you're thinking about sex, then you're sinning. You're doing the Roman 7 stuff here.
Yeah.
And
If
yeah.
you're lusting after a woman, then it's the same as actually doing it. So, you know, like there's this like network of um early Christian sayings that are held together in a way that just ruin this really lovely, important instinct that we have. Like joy, human joy is a moral good. I saw someone say online yesterday. And learning and personal and communal formation is at least involves how to seek joy and delight without hurt and do so for other people as well. And do it only in ways that don't degrade or exploit or dominate or exclude other people. Um, and that sense of the communal is what comes to mind for me in these verses. Because you listed a few different examples of what sarx means, and one of them is ancestral lineage, family. Paul and others speak of, my kin of the flesh.
Right. It's like
Um,
my flesh and blood, kind of that
yeah, yeah,
saying English. Yeah.
yeah, and then here we have also so sarx meaning both like personal bodily self or the inward these inclinations um, that may open us up to um, not being team players, let's say,
Mhm.
and um, and also like a group identity,
Right.
personal identity and group identity. Body is another word there, Christ's body.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. Which it's a
um,
different Greek word, but
it
it's
is,
related, like
but
concept.
they
But
both have
yeah.
this double meaning. And so,
Right.
given our general bias in reading Romans on this hunch that it's less about individual rule breaking and more about the terms of communal belonging and faithfulness. It inclines me to want to read this whole chapter with
Hmm.
that double meaning in mind. Yes, you can read this as talking about, well, I mean, there are certain individual behaviors that are clearly in tension with um, the sacred purposes we're set apart for. Absolutely. And group identity as a birth point, as a locus of all kinds of harm towards other people and ourself,
Yeah.
is a central thing that Paul is like going after here. So hearing flesh as our group identity and what Torah does there. I'm finding that to be a fascinating angle. Like, hey, you have at the individual level, you have a body that gives you desires that can be used to degrade or rejoice, and our group identity that Torah has given us can be used for mutual flourishing, seeking life, or to exclude, alienate, condemn, and dominate. So I'm
Yeah.
enjoying reading this chapter through both of those lenses, trying to have bifocals on.
Yeah. 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 Trying to like there's still this instinct in me from my evangelical days of like, well, no, like it's a fallacy to say that a word means every definition it could possibly mean, and like got to make sure we know which one it is. And it's like, oh man, the anxiousness of that is, it's like, no, be playful, see what's there, play with it, like test it to see if it makes sense with everything else. Like, it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be afraid of
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
Yeah.
Paul may have meant one of those way more than the other. Absolutely. And the way Paul makes arguments, some very load-bearing arguments elsewhere in scripture, are based on similar word plays. If he
Right.
overheard this, like me seeing a double meaning and doing the bifocal thing, and he's like, no, I literally only meant like my material body, but damn, son, that's some good like I think he would I think he'd fist
Yeah.
bump that because he pulls that shit off all the friggin' time with the
Yeah.
Hebrew
It's
Bible.
very, very much something that he would enjoy, even if
Yeah,
it's not what
like
he intended. Yeah.
evangelical and like authoritarian hermeneutics in ways of reading the Bible would friggin' hate Paul reading the Bible how he does. He would be
Yeah, that's
considered
true.
like an intellectual like half-wit and
Mhm.
nonsense speaker for how much he bends the scripture to um what's the saying of people want to have their ears tickled by bad ideas or whatever. Isn't that in Paul? I don't
Is that
know.
a saying? I don't
I
know.
maybe
Yeah.
I'm sorry I have to use the word
Yeah.
tickle twice now, but that yeah.
Oh boy. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I don't know how to move on from tickling.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so, but now after dying, I don't know, is that a good segue? Um,
Yeah,
this
all
makes
right.
me looking at the next verses there, like in chapter verse 6, obligation to the Torah with which we were being restrained was counteracted. It makes me think of a couple of things. One being what we were talking about last time in chapter 6, all the restitutionary justice stuff of like, if I have to pay back 5 cows when I steal my neighbor's one cow, like I might think twice and not do that because that's a pretty steep cost for me. Again, the point isn't to punish me, it's actually to make it right for the person who lost their cow.
Right.
But it still affects me, right? So there is some restraint there from external motivation not to do that. Um, and that makes me think of like I still keep hearing instances of people sharing conversations that they have with conservative evangelical types who are all about like hell has to be a thing, or else what's the incentive not to murder people,
Right.
not to rape everyone you see? Like, That's honestly, that's scary. Is that the only reason you're not doing those things? Um, I don't do those things because I don't feel like I don't want to, honestly. Um,
It doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
yeah. But if that's truly that you see that as the only reason not to do that, that's you need some help, brother.
Right, right.
Um, and then it's a really weird logic anyway, because if only the people who believe in hell, aka like conservative American Christians, basically, uh, are the ones not doing that, they're actually the only ones who have no, in their framework, who have no worry about going to hell because their sins are forgiven. So they could, in theory, go around raping and murdering people
Right.
and still go to heaven because their sins are forgiven. And it's actually everyone else who, yeah, it's a really weird backward
Yeah, there's
argument
like
anyway.
circular reasoning and it's pretty wacky.
Yeah.
Um,
So anyway, that's just what the like obligation of Torah restraining us. That's what where my thoughts go.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um,
Oh, and I did want to mention like the that last end of that there, the antiquatedness of a written document. Um, it's that's one of those ones that makes me squirm a little bit as I was even translating it. Like, is there like how else do I say this? Like it's trying to making like the Torah is the old thing and we should disregard it now. Um,
right.
as you were pointing out when we were talking about this, like he Paul makes it very clear that he really appreciates Torah still. It is not him saying it's worthless or outdated in the sense of we should disregard it now. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Lest anybody hear this or read any of this as a foothold for anti-Semitism, like may it be clear, Paul and we find Torah to be like a wonderful gift that is very good. And I would say broadly by the end of this, you'll see, um, and just taking the wider lens, the way of wielding and living with and under Torah that he is um, lamenting and finding to be problematic is is actually grounded in a there are some broad patterns of exclusion that we could see more broadly that any community does with whatever holds them together. But in this case, they're asking it's a particular historical question of like their way of the Jewish people's way in the first century of holding their story of saying, why aren't we, why hasn't Yahweh come back to the temple? How come we're still under Roman oppression? We were kicked into exile a few hundred years ago. We're back in the land, kind of, but there's still these dickheads over us. It must have been because of our sin as or deviations as outlined in Torah. So and therefore they had a variety of ways of dealing, like therefore, how do we resolve this crisis of maybe our deviations haven't been released, our sins haven't been forgiven? Maybe we'll be really uptight about it. Maybe we'll be violent about it. Maybe we'll focus in on doing the sacred ritual thing really precisely. There's a lot of ways of sorting it out. And maybe personal piety is the thing, and then Yahweh will unleash the good stuff. Um, and part of what he's trying to do here is like work within those questions and show how Jesus, for him, resolves that question. More broadly,
right.
like that's really important to hear. He's speaking to a very historic crisis and circumstance. Because more broadly, he's speaking very positively by the end of this chapter of the Torah of God in my core self, and how these ways of holding Torah are not like something that only Christians can do.
Right.
And they weren't then. It wasn't like all Jews are being pricks about Torah, but Christians have figured it out. That's not what he's saying. And
Oh,
may it not be. And if it was, he was wrong for it.
sure.
Rabbinic Judaism, the lineage that is like was nascent then and has emerged to today, 2000 years of beautiful tradition here, um, is finds plenty of resonance in Paul. Paul didn't create it. These healthy and life-giving and community uplifting ways of being a Torah-bound people. You don't need to be a Christian or a Messianic Jew to do that.
Yeah.
He didn't come up with it.
Even Jesus, I've heard it said that everything that Jesus is recorded to have said in the Gospels can be found in other Jewish writings of the era, with the exception of love your enemies.
Mm. Hmm.
That was
Yeah.
the one unique saying of Jesus, but everything else is people said the same things or very similar things elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, it's as we continue on, let's do that. It's important to
Yeah.
remember that um, the healthy way with Torah that Paul is rejoicing in is not a Christian only or Christian first thing. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Yeah. All right. Here's verses 7 through 12. Then what should we say? Torah's deviation? Absolutely not. Just the opposite. I did not understand deviation except through Torah. Indeed, I had not understood craving except that Torah said, do not crave. However, deviation, taking the opportunity through the directive, produced in me every craving. Without Torah, deviation is lifeless. I was once alive without Torah, but after the directive came, deviation came to life, but I died. I found that the same directive, whose purpose was life, resulted in death. For deviation, taking the opportunity through the directive, pricked me and killed me through it. So Torah is, in fact, sacred, and the directive is sacred and just and beneficial. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I
Yeah.
love, yeah, this is a fascinating one. And like
Mhm.
you said in the notes, that escalated. Uh,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
like this sense that there's like a whole layer of inner life that we don't oh and the outer world that words help us be able to see and bring into focus. So
Mhm.
like Torah is articulating certain things and it's like, oh shit, that is a feeling I have or a behavior. Um, there's there's a
Right.
feelings wheel, an emotions wheel of like, here's this like these radials of different emotions and feelings you have to like, no, seriously, what do you feel in that instance or right now? And like getting more and more and more specific, not just happy, sad, or mad,
Mhm.
but nervous, curious, giddy, tired, weary, impatient.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And when those various feelings lead to trying to meet a need,
Hmm.
that leads to actions, and sometimes those actions have a negative impact on the people around you.
Yeah. Yeah. Like our words create worlds,
Hmm.
including making sense of our inner world. And
Right.
I
You're
it's
giving
almost
it
like
a
Paul
name.
saying, yeah. Like I had the feeling of craving, but I didn't really like have a familiarity with it, a acquaintanceship until this sacred tradition helped bring it into focus for me. And now don't think of a pink elephant. Oh shit, I'm thinking of a pink.
Right, right. Yeah, bringing it into focus, shining a light directly on it in a way that you can see it clearly where you couldn't before. Um, yeah, language is incredible, and you can even like the whole field of like linguistic anthropology
Yes.
really traces out how like when cultures don't have a word for something, they have a hard time even thinking about that concept.
Hmm.
So like a good
Mm.
example is like in cultures that grew up where there's lots and lots of snow and there's multiple different separate words for different kinds of snow. And like for those of us who grew up, and I grew up in California, it's like, what do you mean there's how many kinds of snow are there? What are you talking about? Like I can't even imagine what words you would have there.
Yeah.
Um, it's not part of my consciousness. But if I can learn how to understand the words, then that starts creating categories in my mind for those things, and those things become real to me. I think that's like what you're describing. That's kind of what's happening here.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not just oh, it said don't crave. Well, I'm gonna do it even more.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that is a thing. Like,
Yeah.
there's a when we're directly contradicted, there's a part of us that has this anxiety about our autonomy being taken away that kind of digs in its heels a little bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think there's something bigger than that being described here that's more in line with what you're saying.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And that somehow the flow of argument that he's bringing here is that like Torah does do this thing. It does enunciate deviation and new kinds, original sins,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
in us.
Yeah, I think
And
it's about like shining the flashlight on it. It's like
yeah.
you can see it clearly now. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. And then you go, oh shit, I do have an inclination to do that. Whoa. And like part of growing up is developing that.
Mhm.
It whether you like it or not. And
Right.
so being held in a community that does that together and can really understand what toxic group identity or um, covetousness, craving, um, or slander or infidelity, like
Hmm.
let's parse that out and not make it a stranger. Make it something that we all know together. But it does sometimes initially escalate like, ooh, that is kind of fun. I'm gonna stick with that.
Yeah. 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 Before we started recording, we were trying to make sense of like, so how does that then connect with the next part of without Torah, deviation is lifeless?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is kind of how I made sense of it. It's talking about life and coming to life. Maybe even it's those are the pretty literal translation there. I wonder if it might be helpful to think in terms of like being born or and
Oh.
not yet having been born.
Hmm.
Um, without Cora, without something clearly delineating a path to follow,
Yes.
without there being a path that I'm supposed to be following. So it's like just trudging through the forest where there is no path. Like there's no right or wrong place to go, right? It's just you step where you feel like you can and you do your best. And sometimes you step in something not great and sometimes it's fine.
Hmm.
Um, without Cora, deviating from the path hasn't become a thing yet. It hasn't been born yet. It's lifeless. It doesn't exist yet.
Mhm.
Once I was alive without Cora, walking through the forest without there being a path to follow. But after the directive came, once the path became clear, deviation was born, deviation came to life. Now deviating from the path is a possible thing that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I died because I didn't have a path, right? I found that the same directive whose purpose was life resulted in death. So the fact that there is now a path resulted in death because I deviated from the path. And as it talks about in Deuteronomy in Torah, deviating
Mm-hmm.
from the path builds a world that's deathly for everybody. Right.
Right. Right.
It costs, even if it's just the restitution of having to pay back to make it right when I hurt somebody, when
Mm-hmm.
they tricked me and killed me. And but Torah is in fact sacred, and the directive is sacred and just and beneficial.
Mm.
I feel like at this point, without knowing what comes later, I would just be lots of question marks. Wait, how though? What now?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, with 10 minutes left to record this morning,
Yeah,
let's see where he goes with
move
this.
forward. Yeah. All right. Read the next paragraph here, 13 to 20. Then, did what is beneficial become death for me? Absolutely not. Just the opposite. So that deviation would be brought into the light. Deviation produced death for me through what is beneficial, so that the deviation would become excessively deviated through the directive. Make it real clear. You
Mm-hmm.
see, we have come to understand that the Torah is of the life breath, but I am of bodily existence, that the impulses towards meeting my needs over and against every other else's needs,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or or family belonging, depending on how we're
Yeah.
talking about it here. I am of bodily existence, having been sold into enslavement to deviation, for I don't understand what I perform. What I want to practice is what I don't practice. What I hate is what I do instead. If what I don't want to do is what I do, I acknowledge to the Torah that it is right. But now I am not the one who performs it anymore, but it is the deviation that resides within me instead. I have learned that what is beneficial for others does not reside within me, that is, within my body. For the desire to do things that benefit others is present for me, but performing them is not. I don't do the beneficial thing that I want to do. Instead, the harmful thing that I don't want to do is what I practice. However, if what I don't want to do is what I do, it's no longer I, but rather the deviation that resides within me who does it. The word of
Let's
the
just do
Lord.
all the way through the end of the chapter, and then
Okay, cool.
we are
Next
tight
paragraph
on.
then.
I am tight on time this morning, unfortunately.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Therefore, I find the Torah when I want me to do the right thing, because the harmful thing is present within me. You see, I delight in the Torah of God in my core self, but I see a different Torah among my parts that wages war against the Torah of my mind and takes me prisoner with the Torah of deviation, with the one that is among my parts. I am a person in suffering. Who will rescue me from this deathly body? Thanks be to God who does so through Jesus Christ our Lord. So therefore, I myself am enslaved both to the Torah of God with my mind, but also to the Torah of deviation with my bodily impulses. Word of the Lord.
Thanks be
Thanks
to
be to
God.
God.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, as a therapist, I've got all sorts of thoughts around this.
Yeah, yeah. Like
Yeah,
IFS, internal family systems seems to be uh
yeah,
easily conversant.
yeah. Parts work, which is part of several different approaches to therapy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely the sense of there's a lot of different parts that sometimes struggle to work together. And there's this core self, this true self,
Mm-hmm.
that we want to get in the driver's seat to bring all the parts together, integrate them
Yes.
into one whole. And Paul seems to be lamenting the difficulty of doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, like learning how to integrate parts, particularly as um, they have interfaced with this wider community tradition of moral reflection and practice. Like that all gets tangled up. Like all the parts work I've done with my therapist has had a lot to do with the moral and community expectations of a variety of different communities I've been a part of since elementary school. And all those little reflexive adaptations that emerge within us, in me still, I relate to with Paul here. It's not, it can include like more broad general deviation instincts, but because he's talking so much about Torah here, I feel a certain recognition with kind of learned habits.
Yeah, the other therapy thing that comes to mind is the term externalization,
Oh
which
shit.
is
Okay.
which is part of well, several different ones. Emotionally focused therapy is one of the primary ones that I use. It's part of that. Narrative therapy talks about externalization, and there are others. One of the sayings that I really love from narrative therapy is person is not the problem is the problem. And so giving it like
Okay.
kind of like we were talking earlier about giving something a name,
Yeah.
craving as is the example that Paul used. Craving is the problem. Paul is not the problem. Um, Deviation is the problem. I am not the problem.
Yeah. The problem is not that you're a deviator. It's that you're a person, is that
When
deviation.
deviation shows up in my life, that causes harm. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And that happens sometimes. And like that happens if even if we're talking about like the fleshly impulses, the bodily impulses that we were talking about earlier, where it's about competitive need fulfillment, aggression, uh, those kinds of things. In general, I'm not an particularly aggressive person, right?
No.
Um, and there are moments when I lose my temper. Like
Hmm.
it happens, and then it kind of feels like, well, shit, that doesn't feel like me. Is that who I really am? And
Yeah.
the answer is no. This clearly is saying no, that is not who you are. It is something that you just experienced. It was uh, anger and aggression taking over in a way that is not who I am. I have the capacity to go there clearly because I just did.
And you'll need to take responsibility for it.
Yeah, and it wasn't another person acting that way. It was me, so I need to figure out how to make it right if I hurt somebody, right?
Hmm.
Um, and recognizing that as an exception to who I am and taking responsibility also means figuring out how to make it less likely to happen again.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, I think, what Paul is trying to get to here. And we'll see a bit more of the how in the next chapter, I think. But that's the idea is this that isn't me. Because if it really is me, there's no hope of changing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's I'm not the problem. The problem is the problem. And I can work on solving the problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the true self emerges in the harmony, amidst the harmony of parts and them all being team players
Right.
for the total Brandon project, which was the
Yep.
runner-ups to this podcast name. Uh, well, I've got to wrap this thing up. I'm sorry to cut it short, but I love how well this slides right into Romans 8 next week. I'm so excited for that. Um, thank you all for continuing with us on this leg of the journey. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or a review on whatever website, app, or player, what have you, you've been enjoying this on, especially YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It makes it easier for more people to find the show. You can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. You can read the Liberation and Inclusion translation at www.litbible.net and follow its developments on Threads at lit.bible, also on Instagram under that handle. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Threads as at Old Song New Dance and read more of his work at oldsongnewdance.com. You can follow me on Threads as at BD Rhodes, BDRHODES. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Found in Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Hi, Brandon.
Bye, everybody.